Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here and you're all very welcome. It is my privilege today to introduce you to Professor Moyua Palahi. It's the Nigerian surnames. But Professor Palahi is one of the most prominent thinkers in African philosophy and a very influential person in African voice, specifically with African studies and diaspora studies. He's a professor in the African political philosophy at the University of Lagos, where he also serves as the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Management Services. He's written powerful works on gender and knowledge production, and he has a long list of publications in African philosophy in political philosophy, in development studies, in African epistemologies, and for me, a new one also in philosophical sagacity. I say it correct. Sagacity. I don't know if you know what sagacity is. Go and Google it. It's incredibly interesting. It has to do with the wisdoms of wise sages, male and female sages. In fact, Professor's recent publication is called Women Sages in the Male Epistemic Places, and it's published in a book called Knowing Unknowing. And if you go and Google it, as far as I can see, most of the chapters in that book is open source, and it is fascinating material. So I would really advise you to go and read specifically his work that he's written there about women sages in the male epistemic space. So the work that Professor Faye does challenges conventional philosophies. He emphasizes African voices, and he reshapes the political thoughts on a global stage. So it's for us a great honor that you are here today and that you're going to be speaking to us. You'll be speaking on Africa and colonial discourse, about rethinking how colonialism is understood over time. And we have so many applicants or registrations. Paula and Erica sitting here just bringing everywhere online, and it's sticking through. I mean, I think you said 146 people have registered. So to all of you who are joining us online, also thank you for being here, and I'm sure you won't be disappointed for being here. Professor is going to challenge us to rethink colonial discourse and engage with African traditions in new and transformative ways. Okay. He will have the stage for 40, 45, 50 minutes. Okay. And thereafter, we'll have some time, depending whether it's 40 or 50 minutes, we'll have some time for questions, which we can accommodate till about 17:30, about 5:30. And then I'm going to stop you because we'll only have 30 minutes left to have something to drink and social and be human in that time. So, Professor Moyua, thank you very much for being here. It's our great honor, and we're all sitting here eager to hear what you're going to be sharing with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. Sometimes I ask myself if she was actually talking about me or somebody else. I don't know. I had a while ago excellent class with the PhD student, excellent master class, where we discussed the question of cartoons and satires. It's another innovative way of looking at knowledge dissemination. Before I go into the nitty-gritty of my presentation, I want to thank the African Studies Center Leiden for inviting me, especially thank Madeleine Decker. And I will go way back to thank Tom Dietz, who first brought me to African Studies Center in 2017, and under whose influence we established the Institute of African and Diaspora Studies at the University of Lagos. For 6-7 years, we've had close collaboration with African Studies Center Leiden. And we are hoping that this will continue. And we hope that in the next few years, both Leiden and Lagos will have strong collaboration that will lead to an improvement in the quality of education that we deliver on both sides. I've seen that displayed this afternoon in the quality of the PhD students that you have here. And I'm indeed very, very excited and happy to have met them this afternoon. Okay, straight to the point. I have just 45 minutes or 50 minutes. But I did say that I didn't travel all this way to speak for 40 minutes unless somebody pushes me away from the stage. I will not be easily pushed away from here until I'm done. First, the history of the world. We all know, we are told that Christopher Columbus discovered America. And I want to agree that he probably did. At least that is what history says. But the point is, few events in the world have changed the face of the world, have been so transformational in making the world what it is today. One of such, I must say, is the so-called discovery of the world by Christopher Columbus. The other one that I consider very epochal in transforming the world is in 1789 French Revolution. Very important event in the world. The principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity have been very prominent in the world of democracy. And the way we see the world today, those principles remain very paramount. There was also the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution that replaced the 1917 January Menshevik Revolution and introduced socialism into the world. All of us here, I'm sure, we agree that these were very fundamental, epochal events that transformed the world. One event in Africa that also, perhaps in my view, is epochal and transformed the world is that famous trip of Mansa Musa to Mali, the richest man that ever lived. Mansa Musa, history tells us, is still the richest man that ever lived. And the value of gold after his trip from Mali to Mecca was such that it fell all over the world. His visit is as important and as epochal as that. Thereafter, there have been other very important events that took place in the world. Also, in some way, epochal. Then came colonialism. Also, in some ways, epochal. Now, we have been debating for many years how epochal are these events. There are some events that will remain epochal. And those, for me, those three events I mentioned early on, the discovery of the New World, the French Revolution of 1789, and the Russian Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. You add the fourth, Mansa Musa's visit to Mecca, with all the splendor and grandeur of wealth, gold, and riches. These are very fundamental events. I ask myself, why are there now debates about other major events? I call them major events advisedly. Major events, the transatlantic slave trade, whether it is epochal or episodic. Colonialism, whether it is epochal or episodic. Coloniality, whether it is epochal and or episodic. A number of terms and concepts have been built in and around colonialism and the preceding events before colonialism. Colonialism as a structural concept and discovery in science and in the humanities has become a model for commercialization. Scholars now live on this discussion. A whole lot of scholars published widely have made names discussing whether it is worthy of discussion or not. The question is whether it is worthy of discussion or not, and not the discussion itself. This has taken a lot of ink and attention in contemporary scholarship. I remember the Ibadan School of History lived upon this argument between Professor J.F. Ajayi, whose position is that colonialism is just one event among a series of other events, and Professor P.P. Eke, who is the leading example of the epochal school of thought. To give an insight, I like to watch the television a lot. In fact, most of my friends make fun of me that I like TV. What I like most in TV is watching series, drama series, with several episodes, Some run into 20 scores of episodes. And I ask a question. Imagine you miss one of the episodes and you return to the next episode. Would you not be able to continue to understand the process before then? You would probably. Missing one or two episodes would change the entire picture. So if colonialism were just to be an episode, it means we can ignore it, and yet life will continue. I wonder whether you accept whether it is an episode or not. If it is epochal, it means if you missed one episode, the entire plot, the entire story is lost. Where do we situate colonialism in this direction? Episodic, epochal, meaningful, fundamental, and to the point of determining the future of Africa. I will start my presentation by, I need to move the slide. Yeah, I needed to tell the anecdote of the elephant. A young elephant, I'm sure some of you know this anecdote already, because it tells the entire picture of what we are going to discuss this afternoon. This young elephant was tethered to a small tree when young to avoid it from moving away from the rest of the family. He grew up while still tethered to that small tree. When he grew up and became the real big elephant, he still refused to move, thinking that he cannot still move, believing that he is unable to get out of that tethering. And he stays there. Nobody cares what is going on in the mind of the elephant, whether the elephant is thinking whether to move or not. The point remains that it never moved. It remained where it was 20, 30 years previously, forgetting that a slight movement would have taken down the tree and he would have had his freedom. But this was not to be for the elephant. That is the story of Africa. That is the story of where Africa is today in terms of repudiating the elements that we call colonialism and the consequences of colonialism that largely refers to as coloniality. What exactly is going on? My presentation is going to directly relate to this elephant, and I will keep making allusions to this elephant as we go on in this presentation. The discourse on Africa, particularly as it relates to the insistence on measuring the importance of colonialism on the continent's fate and current state, reminds me of this elephant. For so long, discussions centered on Africa and its development are very often taking their departure from colonialism-informed narratives. These narratives perpetuate stereotypes and fixations that not only obscure the rich diversity of African thought and culture, but also put paid in the final analysis to the likelihood of taking any definitively meaningful step towards the continent's self-actualization. A case in point, which is, by the way, an example and not necessarily my central focus in this presentation, is the ongoing two-way diatribe between the proponents and opponents of decolonization over the currency and relevance of African knowledge production in the global epistemic space. Organized in broad terms around the ideal of true independence Proponents of decolonization assume a hostility towards any colonial residue in African intellectual thought that rears its ugly head. Therefore, in all spheres and spaces of African intellectual and cultural production, from philosophy to music, from language to literature, religion to science, to art, and even with regard to representative monuments in physical knowledge production enclosures, one witnesses agitation to obliterate this or that vestige of colonial presence, and wherever convenient, to replace it with something authentically, indigenously, autochthonously African, even if it means essentializing African knowledge space. In response to this rather obvious extremism, opponents of decolonization have a field day laying out their own equally but more subtly extreme rejoinder. They tear apart, first of all, the assumption of a fixed city to, or even the existence at all of an African authenticity. Next, they highlight the impracticality of a complete removal of colonial influence from the African reality. A task which, if we are being honest, is near completely ridiculous because it will require a magical time travel to the past. But what is very often lampooned are the apparent and latent hypocrisies embedded in such an enterprise, such as, one, the inconsistency, as per Wole Soyinka, of seeking the decolonization of literary output while producing anti-colonial invectives with the use of computer, typewriters, as well as not having anything to say about the development of Western and Oriental weapons of warfare. Second, the exhortation to decolonize everything up to including African education, while cocooned in Western offices, professorial chairs, research grants, and university tenures that are either created by the West or sustained through the funding and organization of the empire. Number three, the lack of knowledge among many decolonization advocates of the ways, means, history, and personages of contribution in African world to the universal pool of enlightenment, leading them to continue to speak only in nebulous terms about an African personality, which largely never seriously explores specificities of that personality genius. Okay. Against the backdrop of these inconsistencies, many anti-decolonization theorists propose not a modification of terms, but a complete disavowal of the intellectual cultural project. They refer to the now mercantile reality of the decolonizing agenda. That is, the fact of an entire research market or industry, more precisely, having been built around the golden goose that is a sellable product. And that golden goose is decolonization. Citing also the larger ideal of a universal enlightenment as Senghor did in referencing Teilhard de Chardin, the civilization of the universal is what people now see as the reason or the quest for the decolonization agenda. And this is why African episteme has been seen as peculiarist and has firmly refused to be part of such ill-conceived bias towards fissioning of humanity. I shall come back to this presently. For the moment, however, the point I wish to make is that while this debate about the merits and the demerits of epistemological decolonization continues to rage. The victim of all the noise is still that entity, that rooted elephant called Africa, which is not able to move forward because it still does not know how to, or that it can. The charter, in other words, is at best distracting entire cross-sections of Africa's stakeholders. You, myself, everybody in this room, people online are all victims of this decolonization argument. From the more urgent purpose that we need to encounter, which is changing things, turning things around, and becoming agents of change than revisionists. At worst, it is a part of the various reasons the elephant, which so desperately needs to move, is not moving. For by creating a semblance, or more aptly an illusion, of Africa-focused activity, these discussions deceive us into thinking that we are doing something for and on behalf of Africa, whereas what it has opened up for us is mostly another field for heat-generating engagement, fashioning a Rubicon where there should be none, and making it practically impossible to work together towards the true greatness of Africa. For this presentation, I am concerned with highlighting the likely consequences of a not seeing eye to eye, or to paraphrase the Nigerian poet John Pepe Clark, not hearing each other speak, especially over the matter of colonialism. I will be doing this primarily vis-a-vis an exploration of different kinds of discourses around the subject of colonialism, decolonization, decoloniality, and reparations. And the two temporal mindsets that have marked the reckoning with the import of the colonial experience on the African government, on the African continent, that is. The question of how much the experience of colonialism has shaped, in the grand scheme of things, the life, world, and development of Africa. I am speaking here of the episodic versus epochal debate, and in a tangential sense, the externalist-internalist disagreement over what is considered to be Africa's problem of underdevelopment. My hope is, first of all, to leave you, as philosophers always do, with some discomforting questions regarding the tenor of African intellectualism today. To ask, with a little variation on Abiola Irene's own formulation over 3 decades ago, whether scholarship in and on Africa has not, on account of its frenzy for colonialism, entered firmly into the dark ages. Furthermore, based on my own answer to the above question, which I suspect will be in the affirmative, I hope to present the dangers of this unwholesome focus on the past and its attendant divisiveness, as well as offer some insights on the importance of emphasizing enlightenment for change rather than revisionism as a driving force for the African intellectual. I recollect clearly that after independence, a whole lot of post-independence African leaders, Julius Nyerere, Leopold Senghor, Tom Mboya, you name them, transformed ideologies for decolonization into ideologies for development, without critically looking at the importance and veracity of such arguments. Nyerere, for example, told us that in Africa there were no loafers. There were no idlers. Everybody was a worker. And in his famous Swahili saying, give your visitor a hoe after 2 days of visiting you. That even if you don't give him, he will himself ask for the hoe. These were some of the descriptions of traditional Africa by post-independence post-colonial leaders that did not reflect the true reality. Yet we are being asked to return to an African past that was communal, happy, pure, rich, whereas this did not, in actual fact, reflect the kind of Africa that existed post-colonial, even pre-colonial. Let us begin by clearing some ground. The colonization, enslavement, and moral subjugation of Africans based on the idea of race calibration constitute a real threat and a real fact of history. I have, in much of my own earlier work, had to recognize this fact and reckon with both its peculiarities and its effects. I have affirmed, for example, that nowhere in the world has there been the combination of the experiences of slavery, colonialism, and racialism apart from Africa. Other parts of the world at best have had one or two, and not the third of all of these experiences. These experiences have put Africa in a peculiar situation where its interpretation of such experience would be different from any other communities. A lot of the transcontinental horrors perpetrated within the combined context of this triumvirate of inhuman politics are well recorded, even commemorated. People still celebrate some of these events, and records in history will show that these things did happen, but the consequences are not ever always put in proper perspective. Take, for instance, the first leg of this tripod of Africa's misfortune, slavery. The so-called slave narratives, of which Olaudah Equiano's interesting narrative is widely touted as representative, provide good insight into the cruel dispossession and dehumanization that Black Africans endured under what was only half-heartedly disguised as a civilizing crusade. In a 2004 article titled "The Image of the Black Soul from the Hut near the Congo to the Banks of Mississippi," I made references to some of Equiano's remarkable narrations of his life as a slave. Permit me, for the sake of its memorability, to return to one of such references, where Equiano describes the despair of the Black African upon encounter with the appurtenances of slavery. And I quote, "The first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived at the coast was the sea, and the slave ship which was then riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo. When I looked around the ship and saw a large furnace of copper boiling and a multitude of Black people of every description chained together, every one of their countenances expressing dejection and sorrow, I no longer doubted my fate. And quite overpowered with horror and anguish, I felt motionless on the deck and fainted. And I saw myself deprived of all chance of returning to my native country, Nigeria, or even the least glimpse of hope of gaining shore." End of quote. Perhaps even more memorable is the summation of Harriet Jacobs in yet another slave narrative titled "Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl," which tells of how repeated dispossession calls into question the sanity of entertaining any ideas of attachment. Why does the slave ever love, she writes? Why allow the tendrils of the heart to twine around objects which may at any point be wrenched away by the hand of violence? These are searing questions. I don't think anyone without that. And if you ask me, the conditions under which such questions are generated will continue to be perhaps everlastingly. As Saidiya Atman in the new preface to an important account of Black oppression in the 19th century America, titled Scenes of Subjection, says, the story of slavery, were it to be told in a single sentence, that sentence will include past, present, and future descriptions. But does this warrant us to dwell on the centralization of the specific history trope of slavery in all of the discourses regarding the enslaved race? Is Africa going to ever continue to discuss the narratives of Equiano and wallow in self-pity? I pitched my 10th family in the camp of present and forward-looking Pan-Africanism. I am aware of the need for, as well as the deficit of, acknowledgement and commemoration. Nevertheless, it is possible to acknowledge and commemorate what needs to be without reducing the Black essence to a pure bundle of enslaved consciousness. I have also once offered an analysis and critique of the clamor for reparations, categorically refuting its claims from a moral standpoint, and even more so from the legal perspective. Africa, I continue to contend, must seek repair beyond blame trading of seeking settlements from descendants of long dead perpetrators. It must reckon with its own present, heal and compensate itself, and take charge of its own future by setting its affairs right today. Then there is our present bone of contention, colonialism. It seems rather clear to me to begin with that this, if it is in any way separable from the enslavement of Africans, is just as evil. It goes without saying that contact with Europeans spelled doom for Africa. I'll return to this momentarily. But as Walter Rodney rightly theorizes, the meeting of two different societies often ends in the domination of the less technologically advanced by the more technologically superior. Africa's meeting with Europe was not going to be any different. Beyond this immediate domination, however, Rodney, through painstaking economic analysis, identifies underdevelopment in Africa as a long-term consequence of the colonial encounter and subjugation. His diagnosis, I quote his diagnosis, the international capitalist system which Africa was forcefully inducted into as part of its conquest was the principal agency of its underdevelopment over the ensuing 5 decades before the publication of his now famous book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. I am of the opinion that a large part of that book is correct. Rodney's analysis is correct, especially when you consider that it was written at a time that that was the politically correct argument to take. If you wrote anything different from this, perhaps you would be politically incorrect to do so, just as George Ayite did in his 3 books, Africa in Betrayed, Africa Unchained, Africa in Chaos. That was not fashionable. What was fashionable at that point was to blame Europe for everything, blame the colonial masters for everything, and everything else would be given unto you. That was what was fashionable. And that was the position, even though nuanced, that Rodney took. Still, while we continue to self-righteously critique the Western imperial constriction of Africa through the weaponization of international capitalism, is it not possible to pose to ourselves the brutal but inevitable question of positive forward-looking responsibility? In other words, to ask ourselves, who is it that must make the change? And to answer it equally as uncompromisingly, that we are. Africans are. Beyond possibility, I believe this line of questioning and response is the must do for all Africans, citizen or leader. As Rodney, whom I have long found out is more nuanced in his analysis than is given credit for, said, and I quote, "None of the remarks about the culpability of Europe are intended to remove the ultimate responsibility for development from the shoulders of Africans. Not only are there African accomplices inside the imperialist system, but every African has a responsibility to understand the system and work for its overthrow. I cannot conceive of any well-meaning African picking a grouse with Rodney over whose responsibility it is to drive the continent's recovery." Finally, on the matter of racialism, because it does not disturb my present purposes, I shall disregard the hair-splitting conceptual differentiation and use the term interchangeably with racism. And in this wise, I only say that, yes, I agree. The annals of history, including or perhaps especially the history of scholarship, are riddled with religious, moral, and pseudo-scientific attempts to justify both the principle and the practices of racial discrimination. I also concede that these have done much damage to the Black African, both on the continent and in the diaspora. The damage this has done and still doing cannot be discussed today. It's a matter for another day. But I will take our minds back to the words of Toni Morrison regarding the purpose of the racist teleology. I believe it is apt for the Black continent as it is for the American situation. And I quote Toni Morrison: "It is important, therefore, to know who the real enemy is and to know the function, the very serious function of racism, which is, in my view, a distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you from explaining over and over. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language, so you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on that fact to show that it is. Somebody says that you have no art, so you dredge the art up. Somebody says you have no kingdoms, so you dredge that up. None of that is necessary. There will always be one more thing to dredge up." I remember clearly when we were growing up as students of philosophy, we were taught there was no African philosophy. And for many years, we kept dredging up arguments to show that there was or there is African philosophy. Rather than doing philosophy itself, we were engaged in the meta question: is there an African philosophy? That is exactly where they wanted philosophy to be on the continent of Africa. But we can't keep, as a continent, responding to some of these challenges. We need to move on. We need to ask questions that are not directed at metas, but at the real facts. I believe I'm not the only one who reads this call to action, as opposed to revisitation from between the lines of the quotation from Toni Morrison. Let us now return to the crux of the matter. Discourses on Africa and by Africans tend to circle back to the theme of colonialism. Indeed, even when the preferred obsession happens to be decolonization, that's belabored rallying cry for the undoing of colonial effects, the focus at root is still the same historical problematic. Thus, regardless of the variations in prefix and suffix, African scholarly and general discursive environment has been largely plagued by what might be called the curse of the post-colonial. Obviously, riding on the prefix too, the curse of the post-colonial represents the burden of the African scholar, thinker, artist, or citizen to nearly always work, think, or theorize against the backdrop of the continent's colonial history. Whether this burden is morally or aesthetically induced, community-pressed, or self-imposed, the danger it has always posed is to preclude us from doing original work, to stultify our creativity and make unattainable, especially for the scholar, the equanimity of mind and tone that is often necessary for objective research and reporting. In relay writing in 1991 describes this last precarity well. Because the African intellectual is constrained to work in direct relation to the felt predicament of a pathetic historical condition, it turns out that African and Black discourse has had to take on either a polemical or apologetic character. At best, essentializing character. Let me reemphasize that Abiola Irele's work was in 1991, 3 or so decades after the wave of independence across Black Africa. Ought to have been a sufficient time, in my opinion, for a continent to figure out itself, trauma and all, and forge its forward path into self-directed modernity and multidimensional sustenance. The pioneer leaders and intellectuals of independent Africa might not have been wrong to press on the need for ideological decolonization, but they would have been more correct to focus on development. In any case, they can be forgiven once understood as the product of the time they lived. What seems unpardonable, however, is the current fixation on that admittedly fraught and revisionist history. Today, the trope of colonization still rings, along with the appendage cognates in virtually all African discourses. Yet, if, as Irele observed 34 years ago, the forward movement of scholarship in Africa was arrested, even compromised, owing to the crisis of development of the continent, why do we not learn now from that failure and focus on developmental scholarship rather than ideological decolonization? I imagine a critical entry to this line of reasoning would be to question what looks like a mutual exclusiveness in the presentation of the two approaches. And of course, such questioning will be germane. Decolonization activism should not foreclose developmental thinking and vice versa. Nevertheless, there is something that can be said for the natural empowerment of one's object of focus. As the Yoruba will say, which means what touches the core of one's heart is what predominates one's thinking and discourse. It was perhaps the decolonizing impulse that led to the African thinkers of old, in the first place, into the quagmire of arrested development, and that ended up sinking the very activity of thought production. I would be remiss to not address some key debates around colonialism itself, all of which serve to perpetuate its undue centrality to the focus on Africa. First, there is the internalist-externalist contestation over the causes of Africa's chronic underdevelopment. Don't worry, don't look at the watch too often. My thoughts on the matter, calculated through a number of publications, have been summarized by a passage in my 2012 inaugural lecture entitled "A Philosopher Interrogates African Polis." Permit me to quickly reproduce that passage. And I quote myself here. I do not think anyone has ever argued that contact with the West has not had negative consequences on Africa. It also did in Asia, Eastern Europe, Latin America, the Middle East, and the rest of the world. But while the other parts of the world were busy winning themselves of the negative legacies of the contact with the West, Africa, in the fashion of the externalists, continued to glorify and romanticize the role of the West in the continuing saga of Africa's backwardness. This is what I call the naivety of externalist dependency syndrome in scholarship. I still call it that to date. In this regard, the debate subsists between the episodic and epochal schools of thought For the former, colonization is nothing more than a series of events or episodes. I already explained that at the beginning. The Olufemi Taiwo, who's one of the archetypes of decolonization, takes a different position from that of J.F. Ajayi. He says, and I want to quote here, that absolutization of European colonization is an oblique affirmation of what Ajayi calls subalterning of history. Subalterning of history. That's what Ajayi calls it. So strong, in fact, is the agency clamp that one of the purveyors of the epochal change thesis, Sabelo Ndlovu Gasheni, is compelled to acknowledge its correctness, even as he argues against episodic interpretations. Ndlovu Gasheni provides a useful entry point into the other point of view. For him, while African agency in the making of his own history must be held to be an undeniable fact, it is also true that the continent's initiative, which Ajayi writes about, is restricted from attaining full expression by what Walter Mignolo calls the global designs, which disrupted local histories. Colonialism came, in other words, and definitively entrenched Africa in the enveloping wave of Euro-North American-centric modernity that unfolded from the 15th century, rather. Seeking another way, which is the important thing to do now, which is the way out of this. I'm rounding off. While in my earlier days as a scholar of African history and philosophy, I entertained and even took sides in these arguments, ignorantly, I must say. I must confess that I now find the totality of this debate depressing. Much so because, to begin with, these conversations appear to be driven by a common temperament whose vision is cast predominantly on the past. It is true, do not get me wrong, that it is important for a people to learn their history. It is equally true, however, that an unhealthy fixation on the historical, especially where there is some fact-related or hermeneutic rancor involved, often threatens to not only make impossible future-oriented action, but also foment a long-lasting, sometimes militarized rift among the stakeholders of the contested heritage. At the end of the day, most important question for community building, however expansive the context, is what do we need to do to move forward? It is not enough to claim, as advocates of decolonization, for example, that the contestation over history is in service of knowing how to proceed. For the question of what needs to be done, fundamental and last resort, as it may seem, can only be delayed or pushed aside in favor of some backward-facing reckoning. In relatively fresh cases of infraction or approval, it is important that we plumb and ask forward questions because they will become the key and the most important things to do. To return to my opening vignette, no one ever would hear what the elephant was thinking, whether it was within itself contesting whether to move or not to move. The point remains that it never moved, and it remained tied to that stick. The reasons why it has remained tied to that stick remain some of the reasons why Africa has not moved. What we see is the inaction and not the internal discourse of the elephant. We also know that its lack of intentional movement, even an attempt, means that that big juggernaut is still tied to the stick. And when the epiphany comes on the last day, the elephant is questioned about its apathy. It will matter little whether what kept it fastened to the straw is the actual tethering or the memory of it. Furthermore, as temporal markers of colonial effects, episodes and epochs are not a set of metaphysical givens. Rather, they are constructed on one or the other from the use or misuse of time. Why so far does colonization continue to present as an epoch to a set of scholars, even though there are millennia of uncolonized African history? That history that produced the Mansa Musa that brought down the value of gold was there before colonialism. There have been other important facts of history that Africa can also put in time frame, but it's always colonialism, always colonialism. The answer, I believe, lies in the sheer scale and magnitude and comparative sophistication of the activities in the said period. The colonial era, in other words, constituted active time because its drivers meant business. They brought an adequate repertoire of tools and mechanisms to bear on their intentions. If Africa continues to dilly-dally about reviving itself, the colonial experience will only look more and more transformative and epochal as time passes. However, to truly make colonialism a mere episode, which is my wish this evening, even if it's a negligible one, we must work against the process that keeps us tied to the stake. We must move against the lingerie of history. Africa needs to start making active use of time. Finally, it is true that Africa can make its own fortune and either make the episodic epochal thought a bloody waste of time. But how then do we make active time? The answer to this is really simple. It is, as a first port of call, to discard pretensions, not to digress. But one of the first pretensions that come to mind is the suggestion that because we aspire to some universal civilizational ideal, we do not then have to worry about hegemonics. While it is a noble and perhaps often necessary thing to think in universal terms, the truth remains that universal civilization or globalization in the observable sense has always suffered a hegemonic direction. And it will continue to do so to the absolute disfavor of our kind. Yet, no amount or level of scholarly ideological work can do anything to displace hegemonies without the supporting might of economic prosperity, political stability, technological advancement, and cultural certitude. In fact, that African intellectuals as a cross-section of the larger continent have purported in their silos to try to achieve some sort of mental decolonization and alliance with stakeholders in other sectors constitutes another delusion. What scholarship in Africa seems to have missed is that if there is any such thing as decolonization, it must be conceived of as an effect, not a purpose. Creating a goal around the colonization of the mind without the creation of the necessary material conditions and firm possession and control of the means of production is chasing shadows. Africa cannot continue to put the cart before the horse, pursuing the moral aesthetic of decolonization and bickering about its necessity and grounding, while effectively neglecting the goal to go after the foundational fixtures that will make all else achievable. There is a need to temper the contestations over colonialism, to pause the creation or sustenance of arguments that need to be won or to work together to build a vibrant future. Let me conclude here with the interesting construction of Robert Frost. Men work together, whether they work together or not. This enunciation of the inevitability, for good or ill, of group work in any endeavor of life is very fitting for the African context. It is either we work together positively to make Africa of our dreams work the way we want it to, or we refuse to work together. By refusing to work together, we inevitably work together. Thank you for listening.